My name is Jovita Andrews, and once I was the Duchess of Westmere, until the man I married and the woman who raised him decided quietly and deliberately that I was no longer of use to them. This is the story of what happened after.
The carriage did not arrive gently. It swept through the iron gates of Westmere Estate like a rumour that had finally become fact. Gold-trimmed wheels, 6 polished horses the colour of midnight, a crest embossed on the lacquered door that none of the assembled guests could immediately place, because it did not belong to any house they had thought to prepare themselves for this afternoon. The coachman sat rigid at his post. The footman descended with the precise economy of a man who had rehearsed this entrance in his sleep. And every conversation on the stone steps of Westmere Estate died in the middle of a sentence. Is that a Silvercrest crest? It cannot be. Look at the laurel above the emblem. It is. But why would Silvercrest be attending Benedict's wedding? Nobody had an answer, because nobody had expected this. Not inside the grand hall of Westmere Estate, where the finest families of English aristocracy had gathered to witness the marriage of Duke Benedict Sterling to Miss Lucy Fisher, chandeliers threw warm light across silk gowns and pressed tail coats. The string quartet was mid-movement. The floral arrangements, white roses and pale orchids, had been praised no fewer than 6 times since the doors opened at noon. Lady Rebecca Peters, mother of the Duke, stood near the altar in a gown of deep wine-coloured silk. Her jewels were tasteful. Her posture was the kind that does not bend, regardless of temperature or circumstance. She had planned this day, down to the arrangement of chairs in the 3rd row. She had reviewed the guest list personally, twice. She had also sent one particular invitation she was certain would not be accepted. She had been wrong. The doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and Jovita Andrews, now Jovita Montclair, Princess Duchess of Silvercrest, walked in. Her gown was lilac silk, clean lines, off-the-shoulder sleeves that framed her neck with quiet elegance. She did not hurry. She did not perform. She moved through the hall with the unhurried ease of a woman who has spent considerable time deciding exactly who she is, and has long since stopped apologizing for it. On her left, a small boy in a deep green velvet coat trimmed with gold embroidery walked with his hands clasped behind his back. On her right, his identical twin did the same. 2 boys, same golden hair, same calm, watchful eyes, same composed expression they had clearly learned from watching their mother navigate rooms. For Lady Rebecca's hand, the one holding the champagne glass, went very still. Benedict Sterling, standing at the front of the hall in a cream coat and polished boots, turned at the sound of the murmuring. His expression moved through 3 emotions in under 4 seconds: surprise, recognition, and then something that looked briefly, unmistakably, like shame, before it rearranged itself into the practiced blankness of a man who has spent years using composure as a substitute for honesty. Lucy Fisher, waiting in the side chamber for her entrance cue, had no idea any of this was happening. The guests, however, knew exactly what they were looking at, because 4 years ago, this room, or a room very much like it, had watched Lady Rebecca Peters deliver, in the soft and precise tones of a woman who had rehearsed every syllable, as the verdict that Jovita Andrews was unsuitable to carry the Westmere name forward. Barren, some had whispered afterward. Unable, inadequate, a poor investment in legacy. Now those same guests watched Jovita cross the marble floor with a Prince Duke at her side and 2 legitimate heirs at her hands, and not a single person in that hall spoke above a murmur, because some truths do not need to be announced. They simply need to arrive. My name is Jovita Andrews, and once I was the Duchess of Westmere, until the man I married and the woman who raised him decided, quietly and deliberately, that I was no longer of use to them. This is the story of what happened after. Hello, everyone. Before we continue, there is something brief I want to mention. If stories like this one, rooted in dignity, quiet justice, and the kind of truth that does not need a speech to announce itself, are the kind that stay with you, then this channel is worth keeping close. The subscribe button and the notification bell take under 10 seconds. They cost nothing, and they ensure you never miss what we bring you next. We would also love to know where in the world you are watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. We read everyone. Now let's get back to the story. Thank you. The estate sat on 14 acres of English countryside in Wiltshire. The main house had 32 rooms. The east wing had been added in 1741. The grounds included a formal garden, a lake that reflected cloud and sky with equal indifference, and a stone chapel where the Sterling family had married for 6 unbroken generations. From the outside, it was the kind of home that suggested permanence. That suggested a family who had simply always existed and always would. Jovita Andrews had grown up in respectable comfort rather than aristocratic splendor. Her father, Sir William Andrews, was a gentleman landowner of modest estate in Shropshire. Her mother was a woman of quiet intelligence and deep faith who had raised Jovita to understand, from an early age, that a woman's worth was not measured by the hall she lived in, the name above the gate, or the approval of rooms she had not yet entered. She was 22 years old when she first attended the Hargrove Summer Assembly in Wiltshire, a gathering of county families that had been held every August for as long as anyone bothered to recall. She wore a pale cream dress. Her hair was dark and pinned with a simple pearl comb. She was not performing anything. She was simply present in the way some people manage to be, that makes a room slightly more alive without their having done anything obvious to cause it. Benedict Sterling was 28. He had the kind of bearing that comes from being told since childhood that rooms should adjust to him rather than the other way around. He was tall, clean-shaved, with dark grey eyes that worked in candlelight and daylight alike. He spoke well. He listened selectively. He laughed at the right moments and went quiet at the right others. He noticed Jovita early in the evening and positioned himself near enough to be introduced. And Jovita, to her own mild surprise, noticed him back. Their courtship lasted 8 months. He was attentive during those months in a way that felt genuine because it was, in the beginning, and exactly that. He wrote letters that demonstrated he had paid attention to things she had mentioned only once in passing. He introduced her to the Westmere Library, a room of floor-to-ceiling shelves that smelled of old binding and lamp oil, and watched her face when she saw it. He asked about her charitable work in Shropshire. He asked about her mother. He asked about the kinds of questions she found herself thinking about after everyone else had gone to bed. He seemed, in those 8 months, like a man who was genuinely choosing her. Lady Rebecca Peters had held a different view of the situation from the moment Jovita first stepped through the Westmere gates. She was not rude during the courtship. She was not warm either. She occupied the calculated middle space of a woman who had learned, that across decades of English aristocratic society, that open disapproval is a card played only by those without better options. Lady Rebecca had far better options. She observed. She assessed. She catalogued. She was measuring bloodline, estate connection, social proximity to families with male heirs, and the probability that a woman from Shropshire gentry, however pleasant, however poised, could produce the son that Westmere had been waiting 6 years for. Her assessment concluded, acceptable. Provisionally. The wedding was held in June, the stone chapel on the estate grounds, 47 guests, an orchestra in the long gallery for the breakfast afterward, white flowers, a clear afternoon. Jovita stood at the altar in ivory silk and felt, without performance of any kind, that she was beginning something real. She was right about that. Oh, she was simply wrong, at 22, about what real would eventually require of her. Jovita settled into Westmere with genuine intention. She learned the estate's rhythms within the first weeks. She acquainted herself with all 14 members of the household staff and made it her business to know each of their names within the first fortnight. She reviewed the accounts for the charitable trust that bore the Westmere name, a trust that had sat dormant for 3 years, and within 6 months had revived it and directed its first grant to a school for girls in the nearby village of Colston. She was not waiting to be assigned a role. She was creating one. Benedict noticed. He told her he was proud of her. He said it on a quiet Thursday evening when they were alone in the smaller dining room, and she believed him because, at the time, she had no reason not to. But before the first year was complete, a different conversation had begun. Not loudly. Aristocratic conversations about lineage rarely are. It began with Lady Rebecca asking, at Sunday tea, 9 months into the marriage, whether Jovita had spoken with the family physician yet. "Just a general consultation," she said, stirring her cup. It would be prudent, given the family's expectations. Jovita was 23. She answered politely. She said she was certain everything would proceed in its natural time. Lady Rebecca set her cup down and smiled the way people smile when they have decided not to say the rest of what they are thinking. Benedict said nothing. The following month, Gracie Jordan came to visit Westmere for a week. Gracie was Jovita's closest friend since girlhood, sharp, warm, and perceptive in the way people are when they have paid close attention to the world their whole lives. She had dark red hair, she pinned loosely, and a habit of noticing things other people let pass without remark. On the 3rd day of her visit, walking the formal garden in the early afternoon, Gracie said, "She watches you differently than she watches the staff." "Lady Rebecca." "She watches the staff to confirm they are performing correctly," Gracie said. "She watches you to determine whether you are proving adequate. There is a significant difference between those two things." Jovita kept walking. The gravel path curved around the rose beds that had been planted in the first year of the Sterling estate. She felt the truth of what Gracie had said settle into her without surprise, because she had felt it for months. She had simply not yet put words to it. She was still at that point, hoping that time and results would resolve the feeling without any confrontation being necessary. She was still at that point, extending benefit of the doubt to people who were not extending any to her. Lady Rebecca Peters had not survived English aristocracy at the level she occupied by being careless about anything. She had married into the Sterling family at 21. Her husband, the late Duke Edmund Sterling, had been a man of considerable pride and limited warmth. She had understood within the first year of that marriage that warmth was a luxury afforded to women who had already secured their position. She had focused instead on securing hers, and she had done it with patience and precision that had no particular malice in it, only an iron-clear sense of what the objective was and what was required to reach it. When Edmund died, she had not dissolved. She had continued. She had raised Benedict with the same architectural intelligence she applied to everything in her life, structure first, sentiment as decoration if it served the structure. She wanted Westmere to continue. That was not evil. That was legacy. But legacy, in her framework, required a very specific arrangement. And Jovita Andrews, however graceful her management of the household, however genuine her dedication to the charitable trust, however warmly the tenants and staff regarded her, was showing by the end of year 1 and then well into year 2 no sign of producing an heir. Lady Rebecca began, in carefully chosen social contexts, mentioning a Miss Lucy Fisher. Lucy Fisher was the daughter of Lord Arthur Fisher of Dorset. Her family had considerable acreage, an unbroken line of sons across 4 generations, and a reputation for what Lady Rebecca called sensible fertility, though she did not use those words in rooms where they might be accurately quoted. She was far too skilled for directness. She said instead things like, "Lord Fisher's family have always been so robust, haven't they? And Lucy Fisher remains unattached, I hear. One does wonder why, and it seems a missed opportunity, a family of that particular quality going unconsolidated." She planted. She watered. She waited. Benedict was not a cruel man in the open sense. He did not shout. He did not issue ultimatums or deliver verdicts across the dinner table. He was far too much his mother's son for anything that direct. He simply began, gradually, to pull back the warmth he had offered during the courtship. More evenings spent in the study, fewer questions about the charitable trust, and a phrase, quiet and recurring, that Jovita would come to know like a weight placed on her shoulders each time it arrived. "It has been 2 years, Jovita." Not a question, not a request. An accounting. A notation in a ledger she had not been shown. By the 2nd year, Dr. Harry Watts, the family physician, a careful and methodical man who gave his findings without embellishment, had seen Jovita twice at her own initiative. His finding, both times, was identical. She was in excellent health. Her reproductive system showed no signs of disorder. There was no medical reason she could not carry a child. He recommended, in his 2nd report, a consultation that included her husband. She brought this report to Benedict's study the evening after the 2nd appointment. She placed it on the desk between them. "Harry says I am healthy," she said, "completely. He recommends we attend a consultation together." Benedict looked at the report. He looked at it for long enough that she knew he was reading it. "My family has produced heirs for 6 generations," he said. "There is nothing to examine on my part." "Benedict, I suggest patience," he said, and closed the folder without picking it up. She left the study and walked to the window at the end of the corridor, the one that overlooked the lake. The water below was still. The reflection in the glass showed a woman she was beginning not to recognize, not because she had changed, but because she was looking at herself through the accumulated weight of 2 years of careful, quiet doubt being placed at her feet like a thing she had dropped and ought to pick up. She had not dropped it. It was not hers. But she was 24 years old and still inside those walls, and she did not yet know how to say that aloud without the saying itself becoming the thing they used against her. She did not cry that evening. She stood at the window until the lake went dark. Then she went to bed. The accusation did not arrive as a scene. That would have been almost easier to survive. A scene has edges. You can locate yourself inside it. You can respond. This arrived as erosion. It began with Lady Rebecca mentioning, at a dinner attended by Lord and Lady Hargrove, that Benedict had been so patient in his current circumstances. The phrase was soft. Lady Hargrove's eyes moved to Jovita, with something arranged carefully to look like sympathy. It continued when Lady Rebecca hosted afternoon tea, without informing Jovita, for 3 ladies of the county. Jovita returned home to find them assembled in the front drawing room, mid-conversation. The conversation paused in the particular way conversations pause when the subject of them has just walked through the door. It deepened when Benedict stopped coming to Jovita's bedroom in the evenings. He did not explain it. He did not discuss it. The door simply remained closed, and no one in the house was indelicate enough to name what the closed door meant. And it crystallized. But in month 34 of the marriage, when Lady Rebecca requested a private meeting with Jovita in the blue sitting room, Jovita went. She had known for some time that this conversation was coming. She had been watching it build the way you watch weather build on the horizon, visible long before it arrives, and unavoidable once it does. Lady Rebecca was seated at the small writing table when Jovita entered. Tea already poured, she gestured to the opposite chair. "I want to speak frankly," she began, "because I believe you are a woman intelligent enough to receive directness without requiring it to be cushioned." Jovita folded her hands in her lap and said nothing. "Westmere requires a lineage. That is not sentiment. It is the oldest contractual obligation in English land law. And Benedict has a duty to this estate that supersedes personal feeling." She lifted her cup. "I believe you understand this." "I understand it very well," Jovita said. "Then you will also understand that patience, at a certain point, becomes an indulgence neither family can afford." A pause, precise and rehearsed. "I am not suggesting you are without value, Jovita. I am suggesting your value may be better directed elsewhere." The room was quiet for a moment that lasted considerably longer than it should have. "You're telling me to leave," Jovita said. "I am suggesting," Lady Rebecca replied carefully, "that a mutual and dignified separation might serve all parties more generously than continued uncertainty." Jovita looked at the woman across from her with the full clarity of someone who has finally had the thing named that they have been watching build for months. She had hoped, and she understood now precisely how foolish that hope had been, that Benedict would stand between his mother's calculation and his wife's dignity. That at some point his instinct toward the woman he had chosen would override his instinct toward the woman who had raised him. He had not stood between them. He had stepped quietly aside and called it neutrality. She set her teacup down without sound. "I will require time," Jovita said, "to arrange things properly." "Of course," Lady Rebecca said. Warm now, the warmth of a woman who has gotten what she came for. Jovita stood. She thanked Lady Rebecca for the tea. She walked out of the blue sitting room, down the full length of the corridor, up the stairs, and into the bedroom she had occupied for nearly 3 years. She sat on the edge of the bed. She was 25 years old. She had a marriage that was ending, a reputation being reshaped by other people's words in rooms she was not invited to, and a private medical report, recorded in clear clinical language, that proved the fault for this ending was not hers. She looked at the window. She was not looking at it to grieve. She was looking at it because she was already deciding where she was going next. She left in October. 6 weeks after the sitting room, she arranged the departure with the same quiet competence she had brought to everything inside that house. She engaged the solicitor her father recommended in London, a measured man named Alderton, who reviewed the terms carefully and ensured her own inheritance, modest but intact, remained entirely hers. He noted, without editorializing, that the grounds cited for the dissolution were weak by any standard of reasonable legal scrutiny. Jovita noted it too, and filed it away beside Harry Watts's report in the part of herself that kept accurate records of what was true. Benedict was present when she left, and absent in every way that mattered. He stood in the entrance hall with the expression of a man watching something he has already decided is finished. He had the grace not to appear relieved, which was the most charitable thing she could say of him in those final minutes. He said, "I hope you will be well, Jovita." She turned and looked at him. Not with hatred. She had not arrived at hatred, and would not. Not with grief, though grief was present, and would continue to be for some time. With something quieter than either. The particular stillness of a woman who has finished waiting for someone to be who they were capable of being. "I intend to be," she said. She walked out. The carriage took her to Shropshire first, to her parents. Her mother held her for a long time without speaking, which was precisely the right thing to do. Her father sat with her that evening and listened to everything she chose to share, and did not once suggest she had done anything incorrectly, or that she ought to have stayed longer, or that she might have handled anything differently. He simply listened. At the end he said, "You are your mother's daughter. Well, you will find your footing." 3 weeks later, she moved to London. She had written, before leaving Westmere, to a woman she had met 2 years prior at a winter assembly in Bath, Lady Catherine Robson, a widow of 41, who ran one of the most quietly influential charity reform circles in London's West End. Their correspondence since Bath had been regular and substantive. Catherine's reply to Jovita's letter arrived within 5 days. The room she took in Kensington was modest. Clean windows, a small fireplace, a writing desk placed where the morning light reached it, a narrow bookshelf that she filled within the first fortnight. She had everything she needed. She began, from that room, to rebuild. Catherine Robson was not what most people expected when they imagined a woman managing social reform circles. She had silver-threaded dark hair she wore simply, and a habit of finishing other people's sentences when she sensed they were being too polite to say what they actually meant. She had buried a husband, raised 2 sons to capable adulthood, and overseen the renovation of 3 schoolhouses in South London without once appearing in a newspaper. She was the kind of powerful that requires no audience. She welcomed Jovita into the circle with matter-of-fact generosity. Not pity. Not charity. An extension of resource to someone she had assessed and found capable of using it well. The circle met twice weekly at Catherine's home in Portman Square. Its members included Gracie Jordan, who had relocated to London the previous winter, close enough to Jovita's Kensington rooms that she could appear within 20 minutes of being needed, and often did. Edward Robson, Catherine's brother-in-law, was a solicitor navigating the legal landscape of education reform with the specific frustration of a man who knows the law better than most and keeps finding it applied worse than it should be. Josh Summers was a young physician who split his time between a private practice and a charity clinic in Whitechapel that operated on considerably less than it required. And Kira Gill was a journalist of considerable intelligence who published under a pseudonym for a major broadsheet and under her own name for a quarterly journal of social observation, the latter of which was, by reputation, the sharpest thing in London that no one in certain drawing rooms would admit to reading. Jovita arrived with no particular ambition to be seen. She arrived wanting to be useful, and she found, in those first weeks, something she had not been fully prepared for. The sensation of being evaluated by people interested in what she could do, rather than in what she was failing to produce. She began with the record-keeping for 3 ongoing school funding applications, work that required care and precision and a clear understanding of county grant procedure. Within the first month, Catherine noted dryly that her filing system was considerably more logical than those of most solicitors she had worked alongside. Within 3 months, Jovita was drafting the applications herself. By the 6th, she was attending county council meetings with Edward Robson and presenting the case for a girls' grammar school in Marylebone. Or the Marylebone application was approved. 400 girls who would otherwise have had no path to formal education now had one. Jovita wrote to her mother that evening. Her mother wrote back, "Your grandmother would have been proud. So am I." What made the Marylebone application significant, beyond its outcome, was how it had been won. Buried in the county records archive, on the third shelf from the bottom and entirely unindexed, Jovita had found an 1861 supplemental guidance document that contained a legal precedent that had been overlooked for 11 years. She had restructured the entire application argument around it. Edward Robson, who had a legal mind of considerable sharpness, read the final draft and was quiet for 30 full seconds. "Where did you find this?" he said. "The archive, third shelf. The 1861 supplemental guidance. That is not indexed." "No," she agreed. "It is not." He looked at her over the top of his spectacles with the particular expression of someone who has encountered a capability they had significantly underestimated. "I have 3 barristers on retainer," he said. "None of them found it." "None of them likely thought to look somewhere unindexed," she said. He laughed, the laugh of someone surprised into it. "What do you know about property law?" he asked. "Considerably less than you, but I am a fast student." Over the following 6 months, Edward quietly directed 3 of his less complex cases to her in an informal advisory capacity. She gained access to legal records she found consistently interesting. He gained, as he later told Catherine, at the equivalent of a junior partner who charged nothing and forgot nothing. Kira Gill noticed a different change. They were both working late one Thursday evening at Catherine's long writing table, both occupied with their respective papers, both in the easy silence of people who have worked alongside each other long enough not to require conversation. When Kira set her pen down and said, without preamble, "You have stopped apologizing," Jovita looked up. "I beg your pardon." "In rooms, in conversation, with people you have only just met." Kira studied her. "You used to adjust constantly. Your posture, your word choices, the register of your opinions, to accommodate whatever the room seemed to require from you. You have stopped doing that." Jovita considered this for a moment. "I had not noticed," she said honestly. "But I have," Kira said. "It is a significant improvement." She picked her pen back up. Jovita thought about what Kira had said for several days after. She had not noticed because the change had not arrived dramatically. Real changes rarely do. It had happened gradually, underneath the daily activities of rebuilding, until one day she was simply different without being able to identify the exact moment it had occurred. What had changed, she eventually understood, was this. She had stopped needing the approval of rooms that had not earned the right to evaluate her. Lady Rebecca Peters had never earned that right. Benedict Sterling had earned it, briefly, and then abandoned it when exercising it on her behalf had cost him something. The right to evaluate Jovita's worth now belonged only to the people who had remained, who had shown up, who had refused to let her disappear quietly into someone else's version of her. Catherine, Gracie, Kira, Edward, Josh. These were the people whose assessment she trusted. Everyone else was simply in the room. The healing didn't happen cleanly or all at once, and any honest account would say exactly that. There were evenings in the Kensington rooms when she sat at the writing desk and felt the weight of what had been taken from her. Not just a marriage, but a version of herself that had believed, sincerely, that loyalty and grace were sufficient protection. That if you loved correctly and behaved well and endured patiently, the people around you would eventually see you clearly. She had been wrong about that, but being wrong about it didn't make her foolish for having believed it. But it made her someone who had trusted and been failed by the trust. That was a different thing entirely, and the distinction mattered. One Saturday morning, Gracie appeared, as she often did, at exactly the right moment with exactly the right tone. With strong tea and bread neither of them got around to toasting, and sat across from Jovita at the kitchen table and said, "You are allowed to be furious, you know. You do not have to be composed every minute." "I know," Jovita said. "Are you? Furious?" A pause. "Some minutes," she admitted. Gracie refilled her cup. "Good. That means the real Jovita is still there." She was. She was simply discovering what the real Jovita looked like when she was no longer arranging herself around someone else's requirements. She met Prince Duke Alexander Montclair of Silvercrest at a charity benefit dinner hosted by Catherine in the autumn of the year Jovita turned 27. The dinner was held for 30 guests. The purpose was to raise funds for Josh Summers' Whitechapel Clinic, which had been operating for 8 months on less than half of what it actually needed to function well. Alexander Montclair was present because the Montclair Foundation had been the clinic's primary donor since its founding. He had come to hear, in his words, whether the investment was being applied correctly. He was 35. Dark, formal coat. The posture of a man who has never needed a room to confirm his worth, because his worth has never required external confirmation. His face was composed without being closed, which is a rarer combination than it sounds. And he had the particular quality of attention, steady, unhurried, genuinely directed, that you notice precisely because it doesn't move around the room while you are speaking. He was, by rank, considerably above anyone else at that dinner table. 3 members of Parliament were seated at the far end. They were aware of this fact and conducted themselves accordingly. Alexander sat beside Jovita. Not by accident. Catherine had arranged the seating. Jovita discovered this later. At the time, she noticed only that the man beside her was asking, with what appeared to be genuine interest, about the Marylebone Grammar School application she had mentioned in passing during introductions. "Walk me through how you structured the argument to the council," he said. She did. Fully, without diminishing it to appear appropriately modest, and because she had stopped doing that several months ago. He listened. He asked 2 questions that demonstrated he had processed what she said, rather than simply waited for his turn to speak. He offered a connection to a barrister in Berkshire who had navigated a similar application and might be useful for the next one. At no point during the meal did he ask how long she had been widowed, the polite assumption that attached itself to women of her age in such circles, or who her family connections were, or what she intended to do with herself now that she was no longer attached to a particular household. He asked what she was working on. He asked what she had noticed that others were getting wrong. He asked whether the girls admitted to the Marylebone School would have access to science instruction, as well as the standard curriculum. By the end of the evening, Jovita had the feeling she occasionally recognized from the best books, the feeling that someone is operating at a frequency she finds genuinely interesting, not because they are performing it, but because it is simply what they are. They spoke 3 more times over the following month. Once at a reading society event Kira Gill had invited Jovita to. Once at the law library where Edward worked, when Alexander came to consult county records. Once at Catherine's drawing room, where 7 of them spent an evening arguing agreeably about whether the current education reform bill was a sufficient solution or a reasonable foundation for a better one. There was nothing rushed about any of it. There was, however, something unmistakable. That on a grey afternoon in early November, the kind of London afternoon that dispenses with pretense entirely and simply gets on with itself, Alexander asked if she would walk with him in the park after the meeting. They walked, wet leaves and gravel and pigeons settling in the plane trees above them. He said, "I want to be plain with you, because I think you are someone who prefers plainness over the alternative." "I do," she said. "I find you exceptional. Your mind, your character, the way you move through the world without requiring it to rearrange itself for you." I have been aware of it for several weeks now, and I thought it more respectful to simply tell you than to continue arranging coincidental meetings through Catherine's very unsubtle social engineering." Jovita laughed. It came out cleanly and without any self-consciousness, and she noticed that too, the ease of it. She could not remember the last time laughter had arrived that way. "She is not subtle at all," she agreed. "No." He smiled. "Would you allow me to call on you properly?" She looked at him. She was 37 days from her 28th birthday. She had spent 2.5 years rebuilding herself into someone she actually respected. She had not done that in order to give it away to the first person who offered something pleasant. "On one condition," she said. "Name it." "That you do not mistake patience for passivity. I am a measured person. I am not a passive one. If that distinction is one you can hold, then yes, you may call." He was quiet for a moment, genuinely quiet, not performing consideration, but actually considering. "That," he said, "is the most reasonable condition I have ever been offered." Alexander called, properly and consistently. He brought books he thought she would find genuinely interesting, not performing interest, but actual volumes he had read and marked and thought she would argue with in the margins as he had. He introduced her to Frederick and Giles, two brothers whose families had known the Montclairs for 40 years, and they received her without the careful social performance Jovita had learned to recognize. They received her as simply her. The months of courtship were unlike anything she had experienced inside the walls of Westmere. Not because they were outwardly dramatic. They were, in many ways, ordinary in the best sense of the word. Evenings in drawing rooms, long conversations over tea that went cold while they were both still talking, walks that began with a destination and ended somewhere entirely different, an argument about agricultural reform policy that lasted 3 evenings and ended without resolution and without anyone requiring resolution. It was the ordinariness that distinguished it, the absence of management. She had spent 3 years at Westmere in a constant low-level state of alertness, monitoring the temperature of rooms, tracking the quality of silences, calibrating her own responses to the requirements of whoever was present. She had become so accustomed to that alertness that she had stopped recognizing it as unusual. It had simply become the texture of being married. With Alexander, the alertness was absent. She noticed its absence before she could name what had replaced it. What had replaced it was ease, not complacency, not inattentiveness, but the deep ease of being with someone who is not testing you. She told him this, one evening in the drawing room of his Mayfair house, while snow was beginning outside and the fire was the only light in the room. He had been speaking about an expansion to the clinic funding and then simply stopped mid-sentence, the way he sometimes did when he had thought of something he considered more worth saying. "I have a great deal of admiration for you, Jovita," he said, "and I am aware that admiration, or stated plainly like that, is insufficient as a declaration. But I want you to know that it is the foundation. Whatever comes next, it is built on that." She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I know," she said. "I can tell the difference now between a man who values me and a man who requires something from me. They feel entirely different." "How does this feel?" he asked. "Like the first one," she said. He crossed the room and sat beside her. He took her hand, the way you hold something you are entirely certain of, without urgency, without performance, simply with complete and quiet intention. "Then I will not waste more time," he said. And the question, when it came, arrived not as ceremony, but as the natural next thing, because it was. She said yes. They were married in spring. The ceremony was held at the Montclair estate in Silvercrest, a property of beauty and scale and an entirely different character from Westmere, because it had been built not to project permanence at a landscape, but to actually inhabit one. The chapel was old stone, with flowering vines along the north wall. 42 guests. Catherine in the front row, looking quietly satisfied with her own considerable role in the proceedings. Gracie Jordan weeping without any pretense of not weeping. Kira Gill taking mental notes she would later claim were purely personal. Jovita wore ivory again, the same color she had worn at 22. But she was not the same person who had worn it then. She knew it, and the knowing felt like something that had been genuinely earned rather than simply arrived at. She was 29 years old. Why, she was a princess duchess, and for the first time since she had stood at the window overlooking the Westmere Lake, the version of herself reflected back was entirely recognizable. The months before the wedding had required their own particular navigation. Jovita had spent years learning to be self-sufficient in her emotional life, building internal architecture that was solid and largely private, because privacy had been the only reliable form of safety available to her at Westmere. She had learned to feel things thoroughly and process them internally, and not require external assistance with the processing. Alexander had a tendency to notice when this was happening, and to simply stay present while it did, without pressing for access, without pretending not to see it. This was, unexpectedly, no more difficult to receive than she had anticipated. She told him so, directly, because directness had become non-negotiable for her. "You are very perceptive," she said. "I am not always certain what to do with it." "You do not have to do anything with it," he said. "I am here. I know that. I am relearning what simply here means without a requirement attached to it." He nodded. He understood, she thought, more than she needed to explain. He had his own history, his own versions of rooms he had walked out of. He did not broadcast them, but they informed the way he moved through the world, with the particular gentleness of someone who has learned, at some point, what it costs to be handled without care. They had both arrived at the same conclusion, independently, about what mattered. That was the real foundation. Not the estate, or not the rank, not even the genuine warmth she felt whenever he walked into a room. It was that they had each decided, for their own reasons, that they would rather be honest than comfortable, and they had found each other in that shared decision. Their children arrived 13 months after the wedding. Jovita was 30 years old. The birth was attended by Josh Summers, who had by that point transitioned from the Whitechapel Clinic to a private practice of considerably more comfortable circumstances, and proceeded with the directness that seemed to characterize everything Jovita did. 2 boys, identical. Born 7 minutes apart on a Tuesday morning in May, when the light through the bedroom window was the particular pale gold of early English summer. Alexander, who had managed a state crisis and parliamentary complications and 2 decades of aristocratic social navigation with steady composure, was entirely undone by the moment the first child was placed in his arms. He stood at the end of the room. He looked at the child. He looked at Jovita. He made a sound that was not a word at all, not an attempt at one, simply the sound of a feeling that had no word adequate to it. Jovita, who was exhausted beyond any previous definition of the word, said, "Do not drop him." "I will not drop him," Alexander said. His voice was completely unrecognizable from its usual register. "Good," she said, and closed her eyes. When she opened them, both boys were in his arms, and he had not moved from that spot. He appeared constitutionally incapable of setting them down, Or they were named William Edmund Montclair and Arthur James Montclair. William for her father, Arthur for no one in particular, but it suited him from the first hour. They grew into toddlers of startling calm, who had inherited Jovita's instinct for observation, taking a room in fully before deciding to participate in it, and Alexander's confidence, which in the boys manifested not as dominance, but as a settled quality of presence that made people around them feel strangely at ease. Jovita watched them in those first 2 years with the particular quality of attention that mothers develop, not anxious, but deeply present, and found herself, in quiet moments, understanding what had happened at Westmere in a different way than she had been able to understand it before. The accusation of barrenness had always been a lie. She had known that from the morning Harry Watts had placed his second report on the desk between her and Benedict. But living that lie imposed from outside, being removed from a household on the basis of it, having her reputation quietly reshaped by it, had required something she had not fully accounted for at the time. It had required her to absorb shame that did not belong to her. She thought about that sometimes while the boys slept. She thought about the women who had absorbed that particular shame and never found their way back out of it, who had come to believe the verdict, who had made the lie their identity, and then lived inside it for the rest of their lives. She had come very close to that. She had stood at the window overlooking the Westmere Lake for long enough that she knew what the edge of that darkness looked like. What had pulled her back was not dramatic. It was small and accumulative. Harry Watts's report in clear clinical language, Gracie Jordan in the formal garden saying she watches you to determine whether you are proving adequate, Catherine Robson extending the Kensington room without a single note of pity in her voice, Edward Robson laughing when she found the 1861 supplemental, Kira Gill saying you have stopped apologizing, as though it were the most natural and obvious good news in the world. The accumulation of small, correct things done by small, correct people without being asked. She was grateful for all of it, permanently. In the specific way, you are grateful for things that altered the direction of your life before you fully understood that an alteration was occurring. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday in October, 2 weeks before the boy's second birthday. The crest embossed on the seal was immediately recognizable. Sterling of Westmere. She opened it in Alexander's study. She read it once. She set it on the desk and read it again. It was an invitation to the wedding of Duke Benedict Sterling and Miss Lucy Fisher, to be held on the 20th of November at Westmere Estate. The card itself was standard estate printing, formal, correct, unremarkable. But attached inside, in handwriting, Jovita recognized with an immediacy that surprised her, was a personal note from Lady Rebecca Peters. It was brief. It said, "It would give us great satisfaction to know you are well, Jovita. We hope the years have treated you kindly. Your attendance would be a gracious gesture." Jovita set the note on top of the card. She looked at both of them for a long moment. Then she called for Gracie. Gracie arrived within 20 minutes. She had relocated to a house 3 streets away 2 years prior, and close enough to be useful, far enough to have her own life, and read the correspondence in full without comment. Then she looked up. "This is a trap," she said. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered with the flat certainty of someone who has been paying close attention to Lady Rebecca Peters since the formal garden at Westmere. "Yes," Jovita agreed. "She wants you present so she can be magnanimous across the room, so she can gesture at you from a distance and convey, without requiring any words, how graciously and charitably the household has moved forward and how well the barren former duchess has settled into her reduced circumstances." "That is precisely my reading," Jovita said. Gracie put the invitation on the desk. You are not going. I have not decided yet, Jovita said. But Gracie looked at her with the expression she reserved for moments when she could already see what Jovita was going to do, and had two simultaneous feelings about it. The feeling that it was correct, and the feeling that it was also the kind of thing that required careful thought before doing. You are going, Gracie said. I have not decided yet, Jovita said again, but they both heard the difference in how she said it. She took 3 days. She walked with the boys in the park. She sat at the writing desk in the morning light and stared at the grain of the wood. She read half a book without retaining any of it. She had 2 long conversations with Alexander, both of which he allowed her to navigate without inserting his own conclusions, because he understood that this was hers to arrive at, and not his to arrive at for her. But on the 3rd evening, she told him what she had decided. I want to go, she said. Not for confrontation, not for a scene, not to perform anything or prove anything to anyone who doesn't already know the truth. I want to go because the woman they cast out as insufficient is now a princess duchess with twin heirs and a life of real substance, and I am tired of that being a truth that only exists in private. Alexander looked at her. I think, he said, that is entirely reasonable. Lady Rebecca built this trap on the assumption that I would arrive diminished, Jovita continued. Either I refuse and confirm by my absence that I remain affected, or I accept and give her the room to perform generosity at my expense. She did not account for a 3rd option. And the 3rd option? Alexander said. Why, Jovita straightened in the way she always did when she had arrived at a certainty. She invited the wrong version of me, she said. They arrived on the afternoon of the 20th of November. The Montclair carriage was not designed for discretion. Gold crest, 6 horses, the particular polish that comes not from effort to impress, but from a standard of maintenance applied to everything without exception. It did not announce itself. It simply was what it was, which, as Jovita had come to understand, was often more powerful than any announcement. The boys were dressed in matching green velvet coats with gold embroidery along the lapels. Kira Gill had, through means she declined to fully explain, persuaded a particular London tailor to complete both within 10 days, and they were 2 years and 2 weeks old, and wore their coats with a gravity that suggested they understood the occasion, though in truth William had a small carved wooden horse in his pocket that he intended to show someone at the earliest opportunity, and Arthur had spotted a large bird over the gates on the way in, and was still thinking about it. Jovita wore lilac silk. The choice had been deliberate from the moment she had opened the wardrobe. Not Westmere's colours, not a colour she had ever associated with that house, her own. It said nothing hostile. It simply said, I chose this, and I choose it still. Alexander walked at her side with the ease of a man for whom arrival in a significant room has never required preparation. Inside the hall, they heard it before they saw it, the shift in the quality of the sound. What conversations that had been moving freely stopped or changed register, or detached themselves from their own logic mid-sentence. The quartet, mid-phrase, lost 2 members for a beat. Champagne glasses paused at various distances from various mouths. And then the doors were open, and Jovita walked in. Lady Rebecca Peters, near the altar in her wine-coloured silk, turned at the change in the room's sound. She took in a fraction of a second that her composure absorbed without visible collapse, the silver-crest crest on the carriage she had glimpsed through the doors before they swung shut, the lilac gown, the 2 boys in their velvet coats, the man walking beside Jovita, with the posture and bearing of a rank that exceeded every person in that hall. The champagne glass in Lady Rebecca's hand did not break. She was too composed for that. but her colour changed in a way that the three women standing nearest to her would describe in 3 separate conversations over the following week in 3 different ways, and all of them unflattering. Benedict Sterling, at the front of the hall, had been partially turned away. When he turned and registered what the room was looking at, the expression that moved across his face was legible even from across the marble floor. It was not cruelty's expression. It was recognition, belated, complete, and entirely without utility. He had had a wife of genuine quality. He had allowed his mother to dismantle her, rather than examining the evidence at his own feet. He had let a woman leave his household, carrying a lie that was not hers, and had called it resolution. And now that woman was in the entrance of his wedding hall with twin sons, a husband of superior rank, and the undisturbed posture of someone who had not spent a single one of the last 4 years thinking about this room. Lucy Fisher emerged from the side chamber at the sound of the shift in the hall. She took in the scene, who the woman in lilac was, why the room had gone quiet, and what this meant for the shape of the day she had spent months preparing for. She was not unkind about it. She was simply a woman in an uncomfortable situation she had not been warned about, with no tools designed for it. Jovita did not cross the room to confront anyone. She did not approach Lady Rebecca. She did not move toward Benedict. She found a position near the windows with the boys, and allowed the room to do what rooms inevitably do when truth enters them without invitation, reorganize itself around the new information. The Earl of Hargrove crossed to greet Alexander within 4 minutes. The greeting required him to acknowledge Jovita as his wife, which he did with the visible recalculation of a man updating a significant number of assumptions simultaneously. 3 other guests followed, then 5 more. By the time the ceremony concluded and the wedding breakfast was served, the social weight of the hall had shifted so completely that Lady Rebecca Peters, seated at the head table she had designed with her customary precision, occupied for the first time in recent memory the position of least social authority in a room she had arranged. Not by confrontation, by presence, not by argument, by fact. Jovita did not stay long after the breakfast began. She had come because the truth needed to enter the room. It had entered. There was nothing further the room required of her, and she had no need of anything the room could offer. She collected the boys. William had charmed an elderly countess with the carved horse, and Arthur had delivered his thoughts on the bird to a genuinely interested footman, and took Alexander's arm and walked back through the hall toward the entrance. She did not look for Benedict as she left. He found her anyway. He was standing near the entrance doors. His posture told her he had positioned himself there with some intention. She stopped. He looked at her, then at the boys, then at the floor briefly, and then back at her. The silence between them was not hostile. It was simply very full of things that had no adequate shape in words. "Jovita," he said. She waited. "I should have." He stopped. He started again. "I did not." He could not finish either sentence. Perhaps because both ended somewhere he could not say aloud in a hall full of his guests, with his new wife at the table behind him. Jovita looked at him with complete stillness. "I know," she said. Not to be kind, not to be cruel, because it was accurate, and accurate was all she had left to give this man. He should have. He did not. Both things were true. There was nothing more useful to add. She walked out. The carriage was in the courtyard, the footman at the door. William allowed himself to be lifted in with the drowsy compliance of a child in whom warmth and novelty have done their work. Arthur climbed in himself with complete focus and considerable dignity. Alexander helped Jovita in last and took his place beside her. The carriage moved forward through the Westmere gates. As the estate fell behind them, the boys settled, The road ahead opened. Jovita looked at it. She felt, and she would describe it this way later to Gracie, over tea in the Portman Square drawing room, not triumphant, not vindicated, not relieved. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely free. Lady Rebecca Peters returned to the estate after the wedding and found that the room she had so carefully arranged had not settled back into the pattern she had designed. It had not erupted either. There was no confrontation, no scene, nothing that could be directly named or directly addressed. There was simply, in the weeks and months that followed, a social shift of the kind that operates in English aristocratic circles through the slow rearrangement of invitations, the altered quality of silences in specific rooms, and the particular distance that polite people maintain when they have quietly revised their estimation of someone. 3 county families that Lady Rebecca had counted as firmly within her social orbit moved to a respectful but noticeable distance. Not enemies. Simply reconsidered. The reason was not complicated. The women who had watched Lady Rebecca dismiss Jovita Andrews on the grounds of barrenness had now watched Jovita Andrews arrive at her son's wedding with 2 legitimate heirs and a husband of superior rank. The original accusation could not survive the arithmetic of that fact, and in aristocratic society, as in most others, credibility once quietly surrendered is not quietly returned. Benedict Sterling married Lucy Fisher. The marriage was not unhappy. Lucy was a capable and clear-eyed woman who had understood what she was entering and had made her decisions accordingly. She was expecting a child within the year. She did not speak of Jovita to anyone and was consistent enough in that restraint that it communicated its own kind of acknowledgement. Whether Benedict ever requested the consultation that Harry Watts had recommended 4 years earlier was not something Jovita knew. It was not something she required knowing. She had her own life. It was full and real and entirely hers. Gracie Jordan threw herself into the Marylebone School with the energy of someone who has found exactly the correct use for themselves. By the following year, she was its administrative director. The school suited her. The girls suited her. She was, by all accounts, the person those 400 girls needed, standing at the front of their institution. Catherine Robson funded 3 further school applications over the following 2 years, and celebrated her 60th birthday with 32 people in the Portman Square. Drawing room and a cake that Josh Summers claimed to have baked himself, which no one fully believed, but everyone ate without complaint. Kira Gill published, in her quarterly journal, an essay on the legal landscape surrounding aristocratic marriage dissolution and the social consequences imposed on women removed under accusations of barrenness. She named no one. She did not need to. The essay was read by exactly the kind of people who understand completely what they are reading. Edward Robson made it required reading for his legal students. It was cited in 2 subsequent reform arguments. It did quiet but durable work. Josh Summers expanded the Whitechapel Clinic. The Montclair Foundation remained its anchor donor. The clinic doubled its capacity within 3 years and was eventually used as a model for 3 additional facilities in neighboring boroughs. William and Arthur Montclair grew into boys who asked too many questions, read everything within reach, and had inherited, in different measure, their mother's precision and their father's warmth. They attended their first formal assembly at age 5 and conducted themselves with a seriousness that made the elderly countess, the one William had charmed with the carved horse at the Westmere wedding, say to her companion, "Those children were raised by someone who knows exactly who she is." She was right. Jovita Andrews had become someone who knew exactly who she was not because anyone had handed it to her, but because she had built it carefully, truthfully, from the ruins of what someone else had tried to make her believe she was. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing that mattered. If you are still here, at the end of this story, then you already know why stories like this one matter. They are not simply entertainment. They are a reminder that character outlasts reputation, that truth outlasts manipulation, and that a life rebuilt with genuine intention is worth far more than the position it replaces.